Diablo 4 is almost here, so it's time we talk about the best ways to make the most out of it, get your first class up and running, and get the perfect start ahead of the true endgame. I got a chance to play through all of it prior to launch, so keep in mind that this is all based on my experience during it. You're absolutely free to play the game at your own pace. This guide is aimed for those who want to be a bit more efficient, so you can always come back later to this. First things first, I'll get this out of the way, but probably the best thing you can do as you're just starting up is to focus on the main story and at most only complete the side quests which are already on the main path. That's because once you roll the credits, you unlock one of the first endgame activities that you'll want to jump into right away, which is the Tree of Whispers. This is by default a solid endgame loot farm that will get you ready for the other stuff later on. Main campaign is also really good on its own to bring you fairly close to level 50. Like how I explained in my final review, I did manage to hit level 48 to 49 with minimal side content completion, besides just a handful of dungeons that I've done for the legendary aspects I needed. The final reason is because eventually you also unlock mounts, which are absolutely needed to faster navigate the huge map. But you also need to progress quite far into the main campaign to get it, and that's why I recommend trying to get there soon. And once you do, your alts can also benefit from this, so it makes their leveling even faster as a result. As for the side missions, the biggest reason you'll ever want to complete them in the first place is obviously just regional progress. That's literally it. More often than not, the XP and the rewards given were not worth it for the time spent that I could just use for a main mission and get a lot more out of it. If you still want to give them a try, however, you are totally free to do so. In that case, I recommend just grabbing all of them once you hit new zones, but only completing the ones on the main path of the main story. Now, the second thing you'll want to do right after is to pay attention and complete the dungeons containing relevant legendary aspects for your own build and class. Pretty much all the strongest builds, especially in the leveling stages, can eventually be achieved almost entirely by getting the Codex of Power unlocks from the dungeons that open up in new zones that the story brings you to. Most of the build defining ones like the Blade Dancer aspect, the Edge Master aspect, Splintering aspect and so on, they become accessible by the time you get into chapter 3, hit the Dry Steppes, Skull's Glen and so on. You can easily track these from the Codex of Power by just clicking on them, and this is going to pin them to your map so that you can easily follow to your destination. At number 3, now that I got some levels, probably a lot of items to shift through as well, here's an important thing that I want you to consider. The number of mats needed to upgrade stuff will grow exponentially, and so will the cost. However, there's no point in having a lot of gold sitting by just yet if you lack the mats needed to, well, upgrade these in the first place. So constantly salvage the rares that you get as you level up, as you'll burn through veiled crystals like mad. You can sell the blue ones if you need some extra gold for now, but having like 100 veiled crystals at level 50 will help a lot to get a few items sorted and just progress a bit easier. You can also salvage the legendaries, especially the ones that you already got the aspects out of, either via extraction or from the Codex of Power, so the duplicates you can just go ahead and grab, because you will eventually need the baleful fragments, the coiling wards, and the other high-end materials to upgrade the much higher item level loot that starts requiring them. And once you get them, you can of course start selling the items for cash once you get the level 50 plus stuff that sells for tens of thousands of gold per piece. So you can more easily farm 1,000,000 gold in the end game rather than focusing on gold early on. Plus, just following the main story like I told you should give you at least like 800k by the time you're done with it. Once you've got the aspects needed, mats and a bit of gold, this is the time to get a few of your items imbued with the legendary aspects. My biggest recommendation is to focus applying these on gear that you don't tend to switch too often. Stuff like amulets, rings, even offhand weapons, and some of the pieces of armor that you do not get to switch too often. The reason you don't want to imbue something like your main attack weapon is because you will switch them literally every other level, if not even more often. Especially below level 50 and even sometimes after that, by the time you think you can do something with your new perfect low level weapon that you just slapped a legendary aspect to, the game literally drops 5 more rares that all deal significantly higher damage. So early on, my recommendation is to keep your main weapons as rare quality because eventually you're gonna get replacements for them, and early on what matters most is the raw damage that they start providing more and more of. So you don't want to like waste unnecessary resources when you can just funnel them into the end game. Moving on to number 5, obviously as you progress further and unlock stuff, another thing to not lose track of is upgrading your health potions, which you can do in pretty much all major towns, especially back in Kyovashad. It sounds trivial, but it's literally 1 minute of your life to make them a lot more efficient and heal you for much higher. The biggest obstacle you might find will probably be around level 30 light healing potion, since that one requires the crushed beast bones. Like you see here, I have tons of the other mats since they are super easy to come by, but not this one. So to get a lot more of them and immediately jump into that tier, you will find a lot of these by just defeating the charging boar creatures around the desert area down south, which I found to drop quite a few crushed bones to get the upgrade for the potions. As you level up, so will your health, and you really don't want to be stuck there chugging potions that barely heal you. At number 6, another build-defining content you'll want to complete is the class quest that opens up once you hit level 15. You will see when they become available as you get a pop-up, but you can also check this priority tab in the missions menu at any time. This includes the Rogue specialization, the Mage enchantment slots, Necro Golem unlock, Druid spirit animals, and the Barb technique slot. Some classes like the Rogue and Mage get it as early as the Fractured Peak, while others like Druids and the Barbs need to wait until later zones such as Coast Glen or the Dry Steppes in Chapter 2 and 3. This will further progress your build to the next level, give you extra powers, and provide some of the strongest buffs. In fact, that's why judging the strength of a class before even unlocking these isn't actually a reflection of how they will behave much later on. And you might be surprised that characters or classes that start super weak in the starting levels will become much stronger, if not the strongest, once you hit the end game. Which brings me to number 7 and the next thing you're gonna want to focus on, which is the regional progress. Each of the 5 or 6 maps have their own tracks that's most useful for the extra skill points, extra potion capacity. They also give XP and extra gold, but eventually also Paragon points once you play in Nightmare mode and finish them that way. You're likely going to already complete half of them naturally by just playing through the story, as pretty much everything that you do counts towards them. Be it simply discovering the map, finding waypoints, completing dungeons, everything gives you these points as you can see them being listed right beneath the challenge tracks. However, long term you will want to aim for maybe close to 100% completion on these, especially for the Paragon points. That's why at this point it might be useful to start completing some of those side missions, especially now that they scaled up and can provide more XP for you rather than wasting them at low levels. Each region gives you at least 4 at the end, which equates to a full level past 50 basically, so that can be a million plus XP that you're saving on to get these a lot faster. Now, Strongholds is another piece of content that you'll want to eventually jump into, which brings us to number 8. Unlock Strongholds as you see them. There are gonna be at least a couple for each region, and while they count for the regional progress as well, that's by far not the main reason you'll want to complete them, but rather because most, if not all of them, have 1 or 2 dungeons adjacent to them that can only be accessed once you have cleared and conquered that corresponding stronghold. Plus, they drop tons of extra loot and, as I've said, count towards the regional progress, and you will always want to have them. Also, the teleport points that they oftentimes give means you have easier and faster access to some of the other areas that might be useful nearby. Now, once you hit level 50 or finish the main campaign, this is when the real fun starts. Which brings us to number 9. Your primary goal as soon as you're here is to push to the next tier of difficulty, which is gonna be the Nightmare mode. To help you better get there, you can always use the newly unlocked Tree of Whispers that makes random dungeons and open world events around the map to give you a lot of new resources called Grim Favors. Each type of content gives you a number of Grim Favors from 1 all the way to 5 depending on the difficulty and duration. Once you've acquired 10 of these, you will just need to head over back at the Tree of Whispers and grab one of the 3 possible loot caches that the game offers. If you're looking for weapons or armors and so on, pick the ones most relevant to you right now, which is going to give you this cache that drops a lot of the items of the same type. They also tend to have really good chances at dropping extra legendaries, plus oftentimes you can see legendary caches that actually guarantee them. So if you're lucky enough, you can get maybe even 2 or 3 dropping at the same time from the legendary variants of the caches, but this comes in a bit later. You can alternate between this and hitting dungeons, but once you're like full eye level 500 gear, I'd say you're kinda ready for the next step. Which brings us to number 10, and that is to go back to Gyovashad and definitely hit the Cathedral of Light. It's much easier than it looks with a decent build, but there are a few boss fights in it that you need to be careful about. Once completed, however, you've just unlocked the new difficulty and accessed a bunch of cool new things. This includes sacred and unique level gear, nightmare dungeons, the new Helltides in the open world, and of course better XP but also more difficult monsters. So as you play on nightmare difficulty, you will notice these shiny variants of the rares and the legendaries starting to drop. These are typically much higher item level than the normal variants, providing much better stats, and will be the items that you'll exclusively focus from this point on once you acquire them. Since everything will now drop these types of items on the nightmare difficulty, you'll get them in great abundance anyway, so you can start really ramping up your build and that damage. However, you will want to jump into your first nightmare dungeon as soon as the game gives you the first level 1 sigils. The reason for that is because this is going to be your next level of progression until you kinda start going into torment mode. To open them, simply activate the sigils from the consumables tab and they will reveal the dungeon that gets turned into a nightmare version on the map. You can see all the modifiers displayed on the sigil itself, so you can better prepare ahead, including the tier level, number of allowed revives before you're kicked out, as well as any affixes or modifiers that affect the dungeons. Most modifiers affect monsters only, such as providing them with extra powers or resistances, but the green ones are actually powers that are provided to the player, such as for example this poisonous evade, which lets you now drop puddles of toxic ooze behind to further damage enemies. As you progress through these nightmare dungeons, you will get random sigils of higher tiers, which is how you will get to increasingly access higher and higher tiers of nightmare dungeons, going all the way to level 100. The higher the tier, the more difficult, but the higher the rewards are going to be. Now, the Helltides are going to be the final mode I'll focus on, since this is another open world type activity that recycles existing content and provides better loot. These spawn a bit less frequently than other events, last for only 1 hour, but you'll still probably see a few popping up throughout the day. You'll know once a Helltide started, as you'll see the regions currently being affected when consulting the map. Plus, when you get close to one, the game fades to this red as blood starts raining from the sky. And during this event, all the enemy spawns in the affected areas will now be replaced by much stronger and more numerous Hellspawn. These new enemies have better loot drops, but they also give you new resources called Aberrant Cinders. With these cinders, you can now open up special loot caches called Tortured Gifts that only spawn inside and during these Helltide events. If you zoom in and out of the area map, you can generally see them being indicated on the map fairly easily, so you can, just make your way over there if you have enough to open them. Generally speaking, the minimum cost that I've seen is 75 cinders for some of the armor variants, 125 for amulets and some of the weapons, and a few of the weapon caches can go all the way up to 150 cinders as a requirement. However, all of them have a high chance to drop a legendary, but there's still a chance even for the ones costing 150 to still drop just a rare. Also keep in mind that if you die at any point during these events, you're gonna lose about half of your available cinders. So don't do that. Be fast, be efficient, and just remember this: you cannot carry over the cinders from one event to another. Once it's done, you lose them, so you're practically just wasting time. And yeah, that's pretty much it with most of the things that you should know. Of course, there's going to be a lot more coming up in the next few days. Diablo 4 content, guides, tips and tricks, and gameplay. So if you want to stay up to date with that, definitely leave a like below, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one.